She came back to her old neighborhood in plain clothes, no badge, no title, just a woman standing on a cracked sidewalk holding a memory of her father. The officers who showed up that afternoon saw exactly what they expected to see, and not one thing more. So when Officer Mercer raised his hand and brought it across her face in front of an entire neighborhood, he had no idea that in that single moment, he had just lit the fuse on everything that was about to come down on all of them. Just before we get back to it, I'd love to know where you're watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed. The neighborhood hadn't changed much. That was the first thing Amara Brooks noticed as she stepped out of a rental car and stood on the corner of Delaney Street and 5th. The same cracked sidewalk tiles. The same faded mural on the side of Mr. Weston's old hardware store. A rainbow arching over two clasp hands, paint peeling at the edges now, but still holding on. She stood there for a moment in her plain jeans, white t-shirt, and a light jacket, sunglasses pushed up on her head, just breathing it in. She hadn't been back in almost 4 years. There was something about this place that always made her feel 16 again, both lighter and heavier at the same time. Lighter because of the memories, the smell of Mrs. Patterson's bakery 2 blocks down mixing with cut grass and summer heat. Heavier because of everything that had happened here. Everything that had shaped her into who she was. She started walking. People who didn't know Amara would have looked at her and seen a tall, athletic woman in civilian clothes taking a slow stroll through a mid-sized American city on a Tuesday afternoon. Unremarkable, ordinary, but anyone trained to pay attention, really pay attention, would have noticed something different about how she moved. The way her eyes tracked the roof lines first before settling on street level. The way she unconsciously clocked every person within 30 feet, cataloged them, assigned them a threat level of 0, and moved on. The way she stood with her weight slightly forward, center of gravity low, even when she was just standing still looking at a mural. Old habits. She pulled out the folded paper in her jacket pocket. A printout of a photograph. Her and her father standing right here on this corner, both of them grinning at the camera. She couldn't have been more than 9 years old in the picture. Her father, James Brooks, had his arm around her shoulders, and he looked proud in a way that only fathers can look. Like you were the single most important thing he has ever done with his life. He'd been gone for 3 years now. Heart attack. Quick, they said like that was supposed to help. She'd come back to mark the anniversary, to stand in the places he used to stand, and just be near his memory for a little while before her next assignment pulled her somewhere else entirely. She was folding the photo back up when she heard the sirens. Not one unit. Multiple. The pattern of the sound told her immediately, converging from 2 directions, which meant a coordinated response to a single location. Her eyes moved without thinking, sweeping the street. She wasn't alarmed, not exactly, but her body shifted into a different kind of attention. 2 patrol cars came around the corner fast, lights flashing, and pulled to hard stops about 40 feet away. A 3rd unit came in from the opposite direction. 6 officers climbed out with that particular energy of men who've been called somewhere and are looking for a reason to justify the call. People on the sidewalk slowed down. A few stepped back towards storefronts. A woman across the street pulled her kid closer and kept walking without making eye contact. Amara recognized the choreography. She'd seen it 100 times. This was a neighborhood that knew how to go quiet when police arrived. She stayed where she was. The lead officer was easy to spot, not because of his rank, but because of the way he moved, chest forward, chin up, one hand resting on his belt near his holster like he'd practiced the pose in a mirror. He was white, early 40s, with close-cropped hair starting to gray at the temples, and the kind of face that had probably been handsome once, but had settled into something harder. His name tag, Red Mercer. Behind him came a younger officer, lighter build, uncertain eyes, constantly scanning his partner's face for cues on how to feel about any given situation. His name tag, Red Denton. And behind them, stepping out of the 3rd car slowly, with the deliberate unhurriedness of a man who understood optics, was a sergeant. Silver hair, pressed uniform, the kind of practice calm that comes not from stillness, but from being very good at performing it. Halvorson. Mercer's eyes swept the street and landed on Amara. He changed direction toward her without breaking stride. She watched him come. She didn't move. She didn't shift her weight or step back. She just watched him the way you watch weather. Hey, he said it like it was an accusation. You live around here? Good afternoon, officer. Her voice was level. Not warm. Not cold. Just level. Is there something I can help you with? I asked you a question. You live around here? I'm visiting. I grew up here. We got a call about a suspicious person in this area. His eyes moved over her slowly, deliberately, like an inventory. What are you doing standing here? Standing, she said simply. Something moved across his face. Not anger yet, but the thing that comes before it, the irritation of a man who expects a certain kind of response and isn't getting it. You got ID? Can I ask what I'm being suspected of, officer? I'm asking for ID. Sharper now. Denton had moved to her left, and she noted it. Not because she was alarmed, there was nothing he was going to do, but because her mind automatically registered positioning. She was also aware of the small crowd beginning to form. A few residents on their stoops. A man who'd stopped his car mid-block and was watching through his window. An older woman with grocery bags standing near the corner, not leaving but not approaching either. Your badge number, please, Amara said. That was when the energy changed. Mercer's jaw tightened. He wasn't used to being asked that. Or maybe he was used to it, but he wasn't used to it being asked so calmly, without a tremor of fear underneath it. That calmness seemed to bother him more than any raised voice would have. My badge number, he repeated, like the words had a strange taste. Yes, sir. Your badge number and officer. She glanced at the other officer. Denton's badge number as well, please. Denton blinked. He looked at Mercer. Mercer's face had gone a shade darker. You know what? You're being uncooperative. I'm standing on a public sidewalk, officer. I haven't raised my voice or made any aggressive movement. I've asked for your badge number, which is my legal right. She paused. I'm going to ask you again, politely. What am I suspected of? And what is your badge number? Behind them, she heard someone say something low under their breath. One of the neighbors. She didn't look. Mercer stepped closer. Too close. Inside conversational distance. Into something else. The kind of closeness meant to intimidate. She could see the tension in his jaw now, the way his nostrils flared slightly. You think you're real smart, don't you? She didn't answer that. Denton, start your body cam. Denton fumbled with it. He said quietly. Mercer, it's glitching again. Then use your phone. And Denton, visibly uncomfortable, pulled out his phone and held it up. But the way he held it, pointed vaguely in her direction, slightly downward, wasn't going to capture what his partner was doing. She noted that too. I'm going to ask you to put your hands where I can see them, Mercer said. My hands are at my sides. They have been at my sides this entire conversation. Don't get smart with me. I'm not getting smart. I'm being precise. She met his eyes. There's a difference. And that was it. That was the thing that broke something in him. Not defiance. She hadn't been defiant. Not aggression. She hadn't raised a hand. Just precision. Just the calm, unshakable refusal to become smaller or more afraid than she was. And something in Mercer couldn't hold it. He grabbed her arm. Not a lawful hold. Not a by-the-book detention grip. He grabbed it the way men grab things when they feel like something is slipping away from them. Tight, sudden, above the elbow. Her body responded before her mind gave permission. She brought her arm up and inward in a single clean motion, breaking the grip. Not aggressive. Purely defensive, a reflex so old it lived in muscle memory. Mercer froze for a half second. Then he slapped her, open palm, across the face, with enough force that her head moved and the sound of it carried down the block. Everything stopped. The street went so quiet, so fast it felt like the volume had been turned off on the world. Somewhere behind her, a woman gasped. The man in the parked car had opened his door slightly. The older woman with the grocery bags had one hand over her mouth. Even Denton had gone still, phone lowered, face pale. Amara stood absolutely motionless for 3 full seconds. Her cheek was stinging. She could feel the heat in it already, the specific kind of burn that follows an open-handed strike. She did not touch her face. She did not step back. She stood where she was and let the moment breathe. Then she looked at Mercer. His chest was heaving slightly. His hand was still raised. And for just a just a crack in the performance of it. She saw something behind his eyes that looked almost like panic. "You don't know," she said quietly, "who you just touched." It wasn't loud. It wasn't a threat. It sounded like someone stating the departure time of a train. Halvorsen had come closer, she realized. He was there now, a few feet back, watching. His expression had shifted from the practiced calm of before into something more calculating. "Officer Mercer," he said, and his voice was controlled. "Step back." Mercer didn't move immediately. "Step back," Halvorsen repeated. Mercer lowered his hand, took a step back. His chin was still up, but the edges of his certainty had gone soft. Halvorsen looked at Amara for a long moment. Then he looked at his phone, which had lit up in his hand. He glanced at the screen, and something shifted in his expression, just slightly. The calculation behind his eyes deepened. "We're done here," he said to the officers. Then, to Amara, in a tone that was neither an apology nor a concession, "You're free to go, ma'am." She didn't move immediately. She held eye contact with him for a moment, long enough to make it mean something, and then she turned and walked away, slowly, not hurrying, because people running away look afraid, and she was not afraid. She was about a half block down the street when a voice called out behind her, "Amara." She turned. A woman was trotting toward her from the direction of the corner. Medium height, brown skin, natural hair pulled back, voice recorder already out of habit in one hand and a phone in the other. Naomi Carter. They'd grown up 2 streets apart, and they'd stayed in touch over the years in the loose, meaningful way that old friendships hold together across distance and time. Naomi had become a journalist, local paper, but with the instincts of someone who should have been national years ago. "I was across the street," Naomi said, catching up. "I saw what happened." Her eyes moved to Amara's cheek, and she stopped, something moving across her face. "Are you?" "I'm Fine." "Amara." "He hit you." "I know." Naomi was quiet for a second, looking at her. Then, "You didn't react. You just stood there. And the way you broke his grip," she paused. "What are you not telling me?" Amara almost smiled. "Almost." "Walk with me," she said. They walked half a block in silence. Amara's hand had drifted to the neckline of her t-shirt, and she pulled out the chain she wore underneath. On it hung a small, heavy coin, worn smooth on the edges, with an eagle and a set of crossed anchors on one face. A military challenge coin, the kind only given, never purchased. She turned it between her fingers once, then tucked it back. "Is that what I think it is?" Naomi asked. Amara didn't answer. She was already pulling out her phone. The call connected after 2 rings. She didn't wait for a greeting. "It finally happened," she said. "I need clearance to proceed." She listened for a moment, said, "Understood," and hung up. Naomi stared at her. "Amara, what is going on?" Amara looked down the street, back toward where the patrol cars were still idling, where Mercer was standing with his arms crossed, and Halvorsen was talking quietly into his phone. Then she looked at Naomi. "Be careful what you publish right now," she said. "Not because you shouldn't publish it, but because the timing matters. Can you trust me on that?" Naomi studied her for a long moment. Then she slipped her recorder into her bag. "For now," she said, "but I want the full story eventually." "You'll get it," Amara said. "I promise you that." She took one last look at the corner where her father had stood with his arm around her shoulders, both of them grinning at a camera. Then she put on her sunglasses and walked toward her car. The phone call Amara made that afternoon set things in motion that had been building for almost 8 months. By the time she arrived at the secured field office 40 minutes outside the city, a nondescript building in a business park that looked exactly like an insurance company and was supposed to, her team was already pulling up on their screens what she had walked into on Delaney Street. Commander Ethan Cole was waiting for her when she came through the inner door. He was in his late 50s, with the kind of face that had spent decades either being weathered by hard weather or hard decisions, and she'd never been fully sure which. He'd been her supervisor for the last 3 years, and before that her mentor through the federal training program, and before that the man who had told her, when she was 26 and still figuring out what she wanted to be, that she had a gift for this work that would cost her a great deal and be worth every penny of it. He looked at her cheek when she walked in, said nothing about it for a moment. "Then sit down." "I'd rather stand." "Amara." She sat. Cole pulled a chair across from her and sat too, forearms on knees. Tell me exactly what happened. She told him. All of it, in order, the way she'd been trained. Not narrative, just sequence. Location, time, subjects, actions, responses. The slap, rendered in the same flat professional tone as everything else, because she'd learned a long time ago that the facts are more powerful without the emotion, and the emotion is more powerful when you save it for the right moment. When she finished, Cole was quiet for a few seconds. Body cam malfunctioned, he said, conveniently, and Halvorsen received a call, right before he ordered the release. He looked at his phone, and something changed in his face. Cole leaned back. He knows someone who knows someone, he said. That call was a check, someone flagging him to be careful. That means they already have my name in a system somewhere, she said. Cross-referenced, which means the corruption network has access to federal databases they shouldn't have. That's been a working theory for 6 months. Cole stood. Come look at this. The main room of the field office had the controlled energy of a team that had been working something for a long time without breaking it open yet. 3 analysts at workstations. Maps on one wall. A timeline on another, color-coded, with photographs and connecting lines that would have looked paranoid to an outsider and looked like progress to anyone who understood what they were looking at. Standing near the timeline was Agent Zuri Hayes, mid-30s, sharp eyes, the kind of stillness that comes from being the smartest person in most rooms and having made peace with it. She was the team's intelligence and technology specialist. She nodded at Amara when she came in. Beside her, arms folded, looking at the map with the expression of a man working a math problem in his head, was Major Daniel Price, military liaison, built like a door, quiet in a way that suggested he chose his words carefully because each one cost something. Mercer, Blake, Halvorsen, Zuri said, pulling up 3 profiles on the screen. We had all 3 on the board already. Mercer as a primary subject, Halvorsen as a facilitator, Denton as a peripheral. Low confidence he's fully in. Higher confidence he knows more than he's said. Denton looked uncomfortable today, Amara said. Didn't engage. Pulled back when things escalated. That tracks with what we've been seeing. He's not a true believer. He's a follower who made the mistake of following the wrong person. Zuri pulled up a second screen. Here's what today changes. The screen showed a timeline. Would have been a slow, methodical investigation with a 6 to 9 month projected completion window, had a new marker on it. Today's date, flagged in red. The incident gives us 2 things we didn't have before, Zuri said. First, a personal and documented connection between you and the primary subjects. Second, it accelerated their behavior pattern. Mercer physically assaulted a federal investigator in public, in front of witnesses, on a street with 3 cameras within visible range. She paused. Even if they think the body cam footage is gone, they don't know about the residential camera on the 2nd floor of the building across the street. How clear is the footage? Cole asked. Clear enough. Major Price spoke for the first time. This also gives us grounds to escalate federal oversight formally. Before today, we were building toward that request. Now we have cause. Amara looked at the board. 8 months of work spread across it. Financial records, property records, personnel files, a web of connections between a city police precinct, a set of private contractors, a property development firm, and 3 city council donors whose names appeared in the margins of enough transactions to mean something. Walk me through the shape of it, she said to Zuri. The full picture. Zuri turned to the board. What started as a pattern of excessive force complaints, buried, redirected, never formally investigated, opened up into something bigger when we follow the money. Mercer and 2 other officers have been receiving regular payments from Shell Company connected to a private security contractor called Harwood Protective Solutions. On paper, consulting fees. In practice, we believe those payments are for information, specifically for tipping off certain operations when law enforcement heat was about to come down. Protection racket, Amara said. Extends into asset seizure, Price added. We have 4 cases in the past 2 years where civil asset forfeiture was applied in ways that benefited third parties connected to the same contractor network. Amara stood looking at the board for a long moment. And Halvorsen? Halvorsen is the ceiling, Zuri said. He's not getting his hands dirty the way Mercer is, but he's the political roof over the whole thing. He's angling for a deputy commissioner appointment. The people backing that appointment have financial ties to Harwood. He keeps the precinct insulated from oversight. They keep the path clear for his career. In internal affairs, 2 complaints in the last 18 months that should have triggered formal review. Both were administratively reclassified before they ever reached an investigating officer. We believe someone inside IA is on the network. Zuri pulled up a name, Lieutenant Victor Stroud. We can't prove it yet, but the pattern of redirection is consistent. Cole had moved to stand beside Amara, looking at the same board. The incident today, he said, puts a human face on something that was starting to look like a financial crimes case. It isn't. It's the same but expressed differently depending on who you are and where you're standing. Amara thought about her father, about standing in front of this same kind of thing at 9 years old without any of the tools she had now, without the training, without the authority, without the coin. Just a kid watching her father get treated like a problem instead of a person by men who decided before they stepped out of their cars what kind of encounter this was going to be. She hadn't become a federal special investigations commander because she wanted power. She'd become one because power, properly directed, could do what bare dignity alone could not. I want to talk about strategy, she said. And I want to be clear about something before we do. The goal here is not to punish Mercer for hitting me. The goal is to build an airtight case that holds up through every appeal, every counter-narrative, every political play Halvorsen can run. We do this right, or we don't do it. Agreed, Cole said, which means no shortcuts, no leaks to the press before we're ready, no confrontations that give them ammunition for a federal overreach argument. She turned to look at them, Cole, Zuri, Price, the analysts at their stations. Justice, not revenge. There's a difference, and I need everyone in this room to know which one we're working toward. The room was quiet, not the uncomfortable quiet of disagreement, but the grounded quiet of people who had signed up for exactly this kind of work and were ready to do it. Zuri had pulled up one more thing. Naomi Carter's name and headshot on a secondary screen. Your friend from this afternoon. She was on the scene. Local journalist, 3 years at the Courier, good record. She's going to start pulling threads. She already is, Amara said. I asked her to hold on publication timing. She agreed, but she won't hold forever. She shouldn't have to, Cole said. The media piece isn't the enemy of this investigation. Handled right, it's part of how the story gets told in a way that actually changes something. He looked at Amara. But she can't know the operational details until we're further along. I know. She trusts me. I'll manage it. She turned back to the board. Her eyes moved to Mercer's photograph, that chip-shouldered stance, that practiced arrogance that she now knew was built on something much more fragile than it looked. That evening, as the team was wrapping up and she was reviewing financial documents in the back room, her secure phone buzzed. Unknown number. She answered on the second ring. Silence for a moment. Then a voice, low and disguised. You should have walked away when you had the chance. She didn't respond immediately. She listened to the silence behind the words, the quality of it, the ambient sound of what might be an office or a vehicle. You still there? The voice said. I'm here, she said. Drop the investigation. Move on. What happened today was a mistake, and it doesn't need to become bigger than it is. She almost said something. Instead, she let the silence extend another few seconds. Noted, she said. She ended the call and sat for a moment, phone in hand. Then she set it down on the desk beside the financial documents and looked at the ceiling. Someone had her secure number. That meant the corruption network extended somewhere into the federal structure itself. Not just local IA, but beyond. Which meant this investigation was bigger and more dangerous than even the board on the wall suggested. She picked up the documents and went back to reading. An hour later, she walked into Cole's office without knocking. He looked up from his desk. I'm formally accepting lead investigator, she said. Officially. On the record. He held her gaze. You understand what that means. After today, you're a target. I've been a target for 8 months, she said. Now I just know it. He opened a drawer and pulled out a folder, slid it across the desk toward her. On the cover, in clean black lettering, Operation Iron Shield. She picked it up, opened it. Read the first page, which contained her name, her authorization codes, her designation as lead investigator, and the scope of the operation. Then she closed it, tucked it under her arm, and walked out. Behind her, Cole leaned back in his chair and looked at the ceiling for a long time. 3 days had passed since Delaney Street. The bruise on Amara's cheek had faded to something yellowish at the edges, almost gone, but not quite. She'd looked at it in the mirror that morning the way you look at a receipt you need to keep for your records. Evidence, not of weakness, of what had started something. She was back in the neighborhood now, but differently. No rental car parked nearby. No direct path or obvious destination. She'd come in on foot from 2 blocks east, wearing a baseball cap and a loose gray hoodie, and she moved like someone who lived there, unhurried, purposeless-looking, stopping occasionally to check her phone. Her eyes, behind the casual posture, were doing something else entirely. She was watching the police. A patrol car had been circling this 12-block radius every 45 minutes since the incident, which was either standard deployment or deliberate presence meant to remind people what presence meant. She clocked the pattern on her second lap around the area. The same 2 officers. The same route. Consistent enough to be intentional. Mercer wasn't in either car, but she recognized one of the drivers from the scene 3 days ago, a younger officer who'd stood at the back of the cluster, looking like he wished he was somewhere else. She noted him, filed him. She stopped in front of the community board outside the Delaney Street Rec Center. Posted notices, meeting times, a lost cat, a flyer for a neighborhood watch program that had clearly been up long enough to curl at the corners. She read each one like she cared about the lost cat. "You walked past my shop twice," said a voice to her left. She turned. A man in his late 60s was standing in the doorway of a small barber shop, arms folded, watching her with the particular alertness of someone who has learned to pay attention to people who are paying attention to things. His name, she already knew from the community profile Zuri had put together, was Gerald Whitfield. He'd run the barber shop for 30 years. He'd filed 2 complaints against this precinct in the last 4 years. Both had gone nowhere. "Nice morning for a walk," she said. He looked at her for a long moment. Then he unfolded his arms. "Come inside," he said. "I'll put on coffee." That was how it started. Gerald talked for almost 2 hours. Not in one direction. He'd ask her something. She'd answer carefully. He'd decide whether to go further. It was a negotiation conducted in the language of people who have learned that trust is built slowly and broken fast. She didn't push. She listened in the way she'd trained herself to listen. Not for the things people said, but for the shape of the things they were careful about. By the end of his second cup of coffee, Gerald had told her about an incident 8 months ago in which his nephew had been detained for 40 minutes on suspicion of nothing in particular, his car searched without consent, and $200 in cash. Money Gerald himself had lent the boy for a car repair, quietly disappeared between the search and the release. No receipt. No explanation. No record that the cash had ever existed. He was scared to file a report, Gerald said. I told him to. He said to me, "Uncle Gerald, who are they going to believe?" Amara looked at her coffee cup. "Can I ask your nephew to talk to someone I trust?" Gerald studied her. "Who are you exactly?" She met his eyes. "Someone who's going to make sure it matters this time." He held her gaze for a long moment. Then he nodded. Over the next 2 days, word moved through the neighborhood the way it always does in places where people know each other. Not loudly, not quickly, but with a kind of quiet, directional intention. Amara didn't advertise herself. She didn't hand out cards or explain her authority. She just made herself available in the spaces where people gathered, the rec center, the church parking lot on Tuesday morning, the bench outside the pharmacy where the older men sat in the afternoons, and she listened. What she heard was a pattern. Not chaos, not random cruelty. A pattern which was somehow worse because patterns have architects. A young woman named Denise Hawthorne told her about a domestic violence call that had been mishandled so severely that her abuser had been released within hours while she'd been the one held for questioning. A man named Earl Sutton described how his small business had been cited repeatedly for minor violations while a competitor with no violations and clear connections to a city contractor was left alone. A teenager named Marcus Webb, 17, quiet, wearing a hoodie that said his school's name, told her with his grandmother present, that he'd been stopped 8 times in 14 months. 8 times. She took notes on nothing. She remembered everything. Meanwhile, in the field office, Zuri Hayes had been doing what Zuri Hayes did best. The body cam footage from the day of the incident had been officially logged as corrupted, technical malfunction, hardware failure, no recoverable data. The report had been filed within 6 hours of the incident, which was fast. Unusually fast, Zuri had noted. Standard procedure allowed up to 48 hours. Filing in 6 meant someone was moving quickly to close a door. What they didn't know was that Zuri had already been looking at the department's backup infrastructure for 5 months. They delete from the local unit, she explained to Amara and Cole that evening, standing in front of her workstation with the particular energy of someone about to show you something they're proud of. But the precinct uses a third-party cloud backup service for administrative files, contracts, scheduling, payroll. That service was configured about 3 years ago and has never been audited. Someone attached the body cam upload queue to the same backup architecture, probably by mistake. Probably someone who didn't fully understand the system. Meaning, Cole said, meaning every body cam upload for the past 3 years has a ghost copy sitting in an archive folder that nobody has touched. Including, she clicked twice, this one. The footage was grainy. The angle was slightly off-center, but it was clear enough. You could see Amara on the sidewalk. You could see Mercer approach. You could see the exchange of words, the grab, the single clean motion with which she broke the grip, and then, unmistakable, impossible to reinterpret, the open hand strike across her face. Nobody spoke for a moment. Then Price said, quietly, "That's your case." Part of it, Amara said. "We need the financial trail to hold too. Otherwise, it's just one officer on one day, and they'll argue it was a judgment error under stress." "The financial trail is coming," Zuri said. "I'm 3 layers into the Harwood Shell Company structure. Give me 72 hours. Naomi Carter had not been idle. Her first piece had run 4 days after the incident. Careful, measured, the kind of journalism that doesn't name names but asks questions so precisely shaped that the names become obvious. She'd written about a statistical pattern of excessive force complaints in the precinct over 6 years. She'd cross-referenced complaint dates with officer deployment records. She'd obtained, through a public records request, the administrative reclassification forms for 2 of the complaints that had been quietly buried. She hadn't accused anyone. She just presented the numbers and asked why they pointed in one direction. The Department Public Affairs Office had issued a statement the same day calling the piece selective and misleading, and noting that the precinct had the highest community satisfaction rating in the city 2 years running. Naomi had already submitted a records request for how that rating was calculated. Amara read the piece on her phone at the kitchen table of the small apartment the team had set up for her near the field office. She texted Naomi 2 words, "Good work." Naomi replied immediately, "There's more. When can we talk?" Amara stared at the message for a moment. Then she typed back, "Soon?" "Not yet." 3 dots appeared. Then, "I'm not going to wait forever, Amara." She set the phone down. She knew. On the 4th day after the piece ran, 2 witnesses Naomi had spoken to for background called her back and said they needed to retract their comments. Neither one explained why, but both calls were within 3 hours of each other, and both men sounded the same specific kind of careful. Not hostile, just very, very cautious. Like people who had recently been reminded of something. The same day, a gray sedan sat outside Naomi's apartment building for 4 hours. Naomi, who was a good journalist and not a careless person, photographed the plate from her window and texted it to Amara without comment. Amara ran it through Zuri inside of 10 minutes. The plate was registered to a private security consulting firm. Its listed address was a mail forwarding service. Its registration had been filed by an LLC that shared an administrative agent with 2 other LLCs, one of which appeared in the financial margin notes that Zuri had already flagged as connected to Harwood Protective Solutions. "They're using their own network to surveil a journalist," Price said, looking at the registration chain. "Which means they're scared," Cole said. "Which means the article hits something real," Amara said. She called Naomi that night and told her to send everything she had to a secondary secure location, vary her routes, and not meet anyone connected to the story in a predictable place. She didn't explain the surveillance detail. She didn't want to frighten her or, worse, accelerate her. She just said, "Be careful." Naomi, who was smart enough to understand what careful meant in this context without being told the specifics, said she understood. Inside the precinct, something else was happening. Blake Denon had been quiet since the incident on Delaney Street. Quieter than usual, which was already quiet. He'd filed his report, consistent with Mercer's version, and hadn't spoken about it afterward. But he'd stopped going to the informal, after-shift gatherings at the bar 2 blocks from the precinct where Mercer held court. He'd started eating lunch alone. He'd stopped laughing at Mercer's jokes, which was noticeable because Mercer was the kind of man who watched for the laugh and registered its absence. He was sitting in his car in the precinct parking lot one evening, engine off, just sitting, when his phone buzzed with a message from an unknown number. "I think you want to talk." "No pressure. Whenever you're ready." He stared at it for a long time. He didn't respond that night, but he didn't delete it either. The response came 6 days later. It was a single line. "Where?" Amara had Zuri trace the metadata before she replied. Not because she distrusted the contact, but because careful was the foundation that everything else was built on. The number belonged to a prepaid phone purchased with cash at a convenience store 11 miles from the precinct. Denton wasn't stupid, or at least he was smart enough to be scared in the right direction. She texted back an address, a diner called Patty's on the east side of the city. Nothing remarkable about it. Selected because it had 3 entrances, adequate ambient noise, and no proximity to any location associated with the precinct or the investigation. Denton arrived 8 minutes late, which she'd expected. He was in civilian clothes, jeans, a dark jacket, a baseball cap that he hadn't quite pulled down far enough to feel hidden in. He slid into the booth across from her and didn't say anything for a moment, just looked at her like he was confirming something. He was younger than he'd seemed on Delaney Street. Late 20s. There were lines around his eyes that belonged on someone a decade older, the kind of lines that come from carrying weight that doesn't belong to you. "I'm not wearing a wire," he said. "I know," she said. "You checked." "I didn't need to." She pushed a coffee toward him. "You came. That tells me enough about where you are right now." He wrapped both hands around the mug without drinking from it. "I don't know what I'm doing here." "You do," she said, not unkindly. "Otherwise you wouldn't have come." He looked at the table. "Then, the report I filed. It's not. It doesn't match what actually happened." "I know that too." He looked up at her. Something in his expression shifted. The particular look of a person who has been carrying a lie alone and has just discovered they don't have to explain it from scratch. "He shouldn't have done it," Denton said. "What he did. I knew it in the moment. He stopped. "You didn't know what to do with it," she said. "He's been my partner for 2 years. You don't just..." Another stop. "No," she said. "You don't just..." "I understand that." She paused. "I'm not asking you to destroy anyone. I'm asking you to tell the truth about what you saw. That's all it is." Denton looked around the diner. His jaw was tight. "If I talk, officially, my career is done. Maybe more than my career. There are protections for cooperating witnesses. Federal protections, not departmental ones." She held his gaze. "I won't pretend there's no risk. But I will tell you that what you saw on Delaney Street wasn't an isolated incident. It's connected to something that goes deeper than Mercer. And people in that community have been living with the weight of it for years without anyone in your position being willing to say what they saw." He was quiet for a long time. Outside, a truck went by and the diner windows rattled faintly. "I can't give you a formal statement yet," he finally said. "I'm not there yet." "Okay, but there's something you should know." He lowered his voice slightly. "The body cam footage. The malfunction report that was filed. Mercer filed it himself. He came in the next morning before the shift started and filed it directly with the tech administrator. He bypassed the standard supervisor review chain." Amara kept her expression level. "How do you know that?" "Because the tech admin is my cousin. And he called me that night because he didn't know what to do about it." Denton looked at his coffee. He filed it the way Mercer asked. He was scared not to. She let that sit for a moment. "Your cousin, would he be willing to document the chain of that request?" "I don't know. Maybe. If he knew he had protection." "Same protections apply." She slid a card across the table. Plain white, a phone number, nothing else. Think about it. Both of you. No they alone. But don't wait too long. Denton pocketed the card without looking at it. He sat for another moment, then stood up. At the door, he paused and looked back at her once. A look that didn't have a clean name, somewhere between relief and dread. She watched him leave. Then she called Zuri. Mercer filed the malfunction report himself, she said. Bypassed supervisor chain. Tech admin who processed, it is Denton's cousin. Potential secondary witness. That's deliberate evidence tampering, Zuri said. Not administrative error. Correct. Add it to the timeline. She paused. How's the financial trail? I broke through the third shell layer this morning. You're going to want to see this. The financial picture Zuri laid out that evening was larger than what the board on the wall had suggested when they'd first sketched it. The Harwood Protective Solutions connection had seemed, at the start, like a handful of officers on an informal payment arrangement, side money for tips, the kind of corruption that exists in enough police departments that it carries its own grim vocabulary. What Zuri had found in the third layer was something more structured. Harwood wasn't just paying for tips. Harwood was functioning as a distribution node, receiving funds from 3 separate property development companies, filtering those funds through a series of consulting and training contracts that listed police department personnel as vendors, and paying out in irregular amounts carefully calibrated to stay below federal reporting thresholds. The 4 officers currently on payroll beyond Mercer included 2 who sat on the precinct's Internal Affairs Review Committee. That's how the complaints got buried, Cole said, looking at the diagram Zuri had built on the screen. They didn't need to pressure IA from outside. They had people inside the committee. And the property development angle? Price asked. 3 of the companies funding Harwood are active bidders on a city development project, a mixed-use redevelopment of 4 blocks in the Delaney Street corridor. Zuri zoomed in on a map overlay. The same blocks where the community has been experiencing the heaviest concentration of enforcement pressure for the last 2 years. The room was very quiet. They were clearing the neighborhood, Amara said. Not a question. Systematically suppressing property values through aggressive over-policing, making residents feel unsafe and unwelcome, then positioning connected developers to purchase at depressed prices once community resistance broke down. Zuri's voice was flat. It's not a new playbook, but this version is well-funded and well-protected. Amara stood with her arms folded looking at the map. The Delaney Street corridor, the rec center, Gerald Whitfield's barbershop, the bench where the older men sat. Marcus Webb's 8 stops in 14 months. Not random harassment, but pressure applied to a geography. Her father's corner. She was quiet for long enough that Cole touched her shoulder briefly. She didn't acknowledge it, but she didn't move away either. We need the legal team in now, she said finally. Not in 2 weeks. Now. Mercer had started asking questions. He wasn't doing it openly. He was smarter than his public behavior suggested, which was something Amara had noted as a risk factor from early in the investigation. His bravado was a performance, and performances require calculation. Underneath the chest-forward swagger was a man who paid attention to things he wasn't supposed to care about. He'd started pulling public records on federal task forces operating in the district. He'd had a conversation with a contact at the city clerk's office about recent property filings that had turned up names he didn't recognize. He'd made 3 calls in the past week to a number registered to a former police union attorney who now worked, according to his LinkedIn profile, in private security consulting. He's trying to identify us, Zuri said. Has he? Not yet, but he's getting directional. She paused. He won't find a field office. But if he's calling that attorney, he may be looking for someone to tell him whether he needs to start preparing a legal defense. Which means he knows something is coming, Cole said. He felt it in the shift on Delaney Street, Amara said. When Halverson got that call, and changed his tone. Mercer isn't dumb. He knows that call meant something. He just doesn't know what. 2 nights later, Amara's apartment was watched. Not obviously. Not a gray sedan sitting outside. This was more careful. A figure in a parked car a block and a half down. No lights, no movement for 3 hours. She spotted it on her second scan of the street from her window, which she did as a matter of habit before sleeping. She photographed it, ran the plate, came back clean, a rental, paid cash, company card from a vendor they hadn't seen before in the network. She called Price. I know, he said before she finished describing it. We have it on the street camera, too. We've been watching for 40 minutes. They escalated from watching Naomi to watching me. Yes. They know I'm federal. They suspect. They're not certain yet. He paused. Do you want to move locations? She thought about it for a moment. No, she said. If I move, they know I noticed. I'd rather let them think they have eyes on me. Gives us information about their surveillance patterns. Understood. Another pause. Amara. Be careful. She almost said she was always careful. Instead, she said, I know, and hung up. She didn't sleep easily that night. Not from fear. She'd worked in conditions that made this feel comfortable by comparison. It was something else. The weight of the full picture now assembled in her mind. The Delaney Street corridor on a developer's map. Gerald Whitfield's nephew's $200. Marcus Webb stopped 8 times. Her father, years before any of this, standing on that corner, not knowing that the same mechanics were at work, just with different names on the paperwork. She thought about justice as a process and wondered, not for the first time, whether the process was adequate to what had actually been done. Then she thought about the alternative. The shortcuts. The rage-shaped paths that felt like power but left nothing standing when the smoke cleared. She'd seen those outcomes, too, in other investigations, other cities. The truth that didn't hold because it was built on something unstable. No, the process. All the way through. She got up and made tea and sat at the kitchen table reading financial documents until it was light outside. The legal team, 3 federal prosecutors led by a senior attorney named Margaret Holloway, who had a reputation for building cases that didn't lose, came in on a Thursday morning and spent 6 hours going through everything the team had compiled. At the end of 6 hours, Holloway set down her pen and said, "This is solid. It's not complete, but it's solid. What's the timeline on the remaining financial documentation?" 1 week, Zuri said. Maybe less. And the Denton situation? Developing, Amara said. Holloway nodded. The body cam evidence alone gives us the physical assault. The financial network gives us organized corruption and civil rights violations under color of law. If Denton's cousin will document the tampering chain, we can add obstruction. She looked at Amara. What's your read on Denton? He's not there yet, but he's close. She paused. He's a decent person in a situation that didn't give him good options for a long time. Now he's seeing one. Holloway picked up her pen again. Get him there. The moment that changed everything came on a Friday afternoon. Mercer had been digging. He'd spent 2 weeks pulling at threads and following names and making calls. And on that Friday afternoon, something connected. A name that appeared in a public filing related to federal task force operations in the district, cross-referenced with a face he'd seen on Delaney Street in civilian clothes. He was sitting in his car in the precinct parking lot when it clicked. He pulled up the federal directory on his phone, searched the name, found the rank, the division, the assignment history. He sat very still for almost a full minute. Then he called Halvorson. We have a problem, he said when Halvorson picked up. The woman on Delaney Street. He paused. She's a federal special investigations commander. She's been running a federal investigation. And I hit her in the face in front of witnesses. The silence on the other end of the line was the kind that has weight. How long has she been building this? Halvorson said, very quietly. I don't know. Long enough. Another silence. Then Mercer said it. Not to Halvorson, not exactly, more to the space between himself and what he'd done. The full realization arriving all at once like a wave that's been building offshore for longer than you knew. We didn't just hit the wrong woman, he said. We hit the worst possible one. The week after Mercer discovered who Amara was, he didn't fall apart. That was the thing about him. And it was something Amara had noted early and flagged in her profile of him. He was not a man who crumbled under pressure. He was a man who converted pressure into aggression and called the result decisiveness. So instead of going quiet, instead of pulling back and hoping the storm passed, he leaned forward. He started moving pieces. The first move was subtle. A patrol car began making extra passes on Delaney Street. Not Mercer's car, not any car directly linked to him. Just a presence. An increase in stop frequency that wasn't dramatic enough to look retaliatory, but was consistent enough that Gerald Whitfield noticed and called the number Amara had left him. 3 stops in 2 days, Gerald said. Young men walking to work. Nothing found. Nobody charged. Just stopped and questioned and sent on their way feeling about 2 inches tall. Document it, Amara said. Times, officer numbers, if visible, descriptions of the individuals stopped. Everything. I've been documenting things for 30 years, Gerald said. And there was something quiet and tired in his voice that said more than the words did. Hasn't done much good so far. It will this time, she said. She believed it. She needed to believe it to do the work. But she heard what was underneath his words and held it alongside all the other things she was holding. The second move Mercer made was against potential witnesses. He didn't approach them directly. He was too careful for that now, operating with the particular caution of someone who suspects they are being watched. Instead, he used intermediaries. A word here, a reminder there. The informal language of a man reminding people in his orbit that loyalty had value and its absence had consequences. 2 of Naomi's background sources went silent. A third called her, voice tight, and said he'd never spoken to her. She reported all of it to Amara without drama, in the clipped professional tone of someone who is angry but channeling it into precision. He's trying to collapse the witness structure before it solidifies, Amara said to Cole that evening. Which means he knows we're building one, Cole said. He doesn't know the specifics, but he's smart enough to run the playbook anyway. She looked at the board. We need Denton to move. If his cousin documents the tampering chain, we take obstruction off the table as something Mercer can maneuver around. Cole looked at her. Denton reached out? Not yet, but he will. She paused. He's carrying it alone, and it's getting heavier. He'll reach the point where putting it down is easier than holding it. She was right about the weight. She just underestimated how close Denton already was to his limit. He'd been sleeping badly. His wife, Carla, had asked twice what was wrong, and both times he'd said work, which was true in the way that saying the ocean is wet is true. She'd stopped asking after the second time, which was worse somehow than her asking. The silence between them had taken on the quality of something careful, like both of them were walking around something breakable on the floor. He'd also been watching Mercer differently. The way Mercer moved through the precinct, now, tighter, faster, eyes scanning, looked less like confidence and more like a man running calculations constantly. Denton had worked beside him for 2 years and knew the difference. Mercer wasn't in control. Mercer was performing control, and the performance was showing its seams. On a Wednesday morning, Denton sat in his car outside the precinct for 11 minutes before going in. Then he took out his phone and sent a single message to the number Amara had given him. I need to do this properly. Tell me what that looks like. She replied within 4 minutes with a time and a location. The second meeting was longer than the first and different in tone, less tentative, more procedural. Amara brought Zuri, who walked Denton through the formal witness protection framework in plain language. No jargon, no intimidation. Denton listened with his hands flat on the table and asked 3 specific questions, all of them practical, all of them about his family rather than himself. By the end of the meeting, he had agreed to provide a formal statement. He also made a call from the table, right there, to his cousin at the tech administration office. The call lasted 6 minutes. His cousin, a soft-spoken man named Calvin Reese who had been living with his own version of Denton's weight since the morning Mercer walked in and told him to file the malfunction report, agreed to document everything. He sounded relieved, Denton said after he hung up, like he'd been waiting for someone to ask. Zuri was already typing. While Mercer was tightening his grip on one side of the case, Halvorsen was working a different angle entirely. Halvorsen had spent 3 decades learning that the most durable form of protection wasn't force. It was narrative. You didn't fight accusations directly. You shaped the context in which they would be received. So he had begun, quietly and through the right channels, to plan a story. The story went like this. A federal task force with unclear jurisdiction and apparent political motivation had inserted itself into a local department that was performing well by every measurable standard. The task force was led by a commander with a personal grievance following a minor incident that had been blown out of proportion. The real agenda wasn't accountability. It was federal overreach into local law enforcement, a trend that threatened the operational independence of every police department in the country. It wasn't a stupid story. It had the architecture of something plausible. It acknowledged the incident while reframing it. It positioned Halvorsen as a defender of institutional integrity rather than a subject of investigation. And it had already reached 3 city council members and 1 state legislator, all of whom had received campaign contributions from entities connected to the Harwood network. One of those council members put in a call to a federal liaison office asking whether the task force had proper authorization documentation. Cole fielded the call personally and spent 45 minutes on the phone, calmly and thoroughly, laying out the authorization chain in detail that left no procedural gap unexploited. When he hung up, he looked at Amara across the office and said, "They're trying to build a box around us." "They're scared," she said. "Scared people are dangerous." "I know." She looked at the board, "which is why we moved to containment posture. No more slow gathering. We hold what we have, and we prepare for exposure." The anonymous messages to her secure phone had increased to 4 in the past week. They'd escalated from implied career threats to something more personal. One had included a reference to her late father that could only have come from someone who had accessed her personnel file. She logged each one, traced what could be traced, and not mentioned them to anyone except Cole and Price. Price had responded to the last one by quietly activating 2 additional security personnel from the military liaison office to maintain a discreet presence on her location. She hadn't argued. She wasn't reckless about her own safety. She just didn't have much patience for letting safety concerns become the thing that slowed the work down. She did, however, call Commander Cole one evening and sit across from him in his office for an hour without talking about the case at all. He poured 2 cups of coffee and let her lead. She talked about her father for a while, about the morning she'd gotten the call about his heart attack and had been in the middle of a briefing in a different city and had excused herself to the hallway and stood there for a long time before going back in to finish the briefing because she hadn't known what else to do. About the way she sometimes wondered if the work was a way of being close to him or a way of avoiding how much she missed him. Cole had listened without offering solutions, which was why she'd come to him. "He'd think you were doing the right thing," Cole said eventually. "I know," she said. "That's not the same as it being easy." "No," he said. "It never is." She went back to work. Across the city, Naomi Carter had been building toward something. She'd spent the past 3 weeks going beyond the precinct. She'd filed public records requests in 4 neighboring jurisdictions. She'd spoken to 11 former residents of the Delaney Street corridor who had relocated in the past 2 years. People who had sold at prices below market. People who had left because the environment had become hostile in ways that were hard to name in a single incident report, but were cumulative and exhausting and eventually decisive. She traced 3 of those properties forward through their transaction history and found them sitting and holding companies whose beneficial ownership connected, through 2 intermediate entities, to the same developer network Zuri had identified from the financial side. She had a story, a real one, the kind that didn't need to hedge or imply. It could just lay out the documented chain and let it speak. She called Amara on a Thursday evening. "I'm ready to publish," she said. "I've given you time. The story is solid. I'm not going to hold it past Monday." Amara looked at the ceiling of her apartment. Monday was 4 days away. They were close, closer than Naomi knew, but 4 days wasn't enough to finalize the indictment timeline. "Will you let me read it before it runs?" Amara asked. "For factual accuracy, yes. Not for redaction. Factual accuracy is all I'm asking." A pause. "Send me your secure email." The article ran the following Monday. 8,000 words. Documented. Sourced. Precise. It didn't use the word corruption once. It didn't name Mercer or Halvorsen by name. What it did was lay out, with the quiet authority of verified records and traced transaction histories, how a neighborhood had been systematically pressured, how complaints had disappeared, how properties had changed hands, and how the people who had lived on those blocks for generations had been made to feel, through accumulated force and presence, and stopped cars and $200 bills that vanished, that they did not belong in their own streets. It named no individual villains. It described a system. And somehow that was more devastating than names would have been. The article landed on a Monday morning, and by noon it had been picked up by 3 national outlets. By 3 in the afternoon, the city's community board had issued a statement demanding an independent review of the precinct's complaint handling procedures. By 5, 2 city council members who had received Halvorson's narrative were quietly declining to return calls from his office. By the time the evening news led with a segment that showed a map of the Delaney Street corridor alongside a graphic tracking complaint burial rates, the department's public affairs office had issued 2 statements, both of which managed the impressive feat of saying nothing while sounding like they were saying something. Amara watched the news segment from the field office without expression. Around her, the team was monitoring reaction across channels: social media, press wire, internal communications intercepts from the precinct's non-secure networks. "Department leadership is rattled," Zuri said, not looking up from her screen. 3 senior administrators have exchanged messages in the last hour about, quote, managing the federal situation. "Are they moving files?" Cole asked. "Monitoring for it. Nothing yet. Watch for it. If they start moving or deleting, we invoke Emergency Preservation Authority." Amara's phone had been ringing steadily since the article dropped. Colleagues, people she'd worked with in other cities, 2 former supervisors from earlier in her career who had read the piece and understood enough to read between its lines. She let most of them go to voicemail. The ones she answered she kept brief. The community response was different from what she'd anticipated. She'd expected anger, and there was anger, real and legitimate and long overdue. But there was something else alongside it that she hadn't quite prepared for. People were coming forward. Not to the press, not yet. To the number Gerald Whitfield had been quietly sharing on Delaney Street and in the surrounding blocks. To Zuri's secure intake form, which had been live for 3 weeks and had received 11 submissions before Monday morning. By Tuesday evening, it had received 43 more. People describing stops, searches, missing property. A woman who had been detained for questioning in a case she had nothing to do with and had lost her job because of the hours spent in that detention. A man whose small contracting business had been cited by city inspectors. Not police, but connected inspectors, in a pattern that had eventually made the business unviable. Connections to the Harwood network that Zuri was cross-referencing in real time. "This is the part they never account for," Price said quietly, standing beside Amara looking at the intake form numbers climbing. "They think they can keep a lid on how many people they've touched. But when the lid comes off, everyone who's been waiting realizes they weren't alone," Amara said. On Tuesday morning, the city's Internal Affairs Division issued a public statement announcing a preliminary review of the complaint handling procedures identified in Naomi's article. The statement was careful and non-committal. A review, not an investigation, preliminary procedures, not individuals, but it represented something that hadn't existed Monday morning. External pressure had created internal motion. Cole read the statement and said, "They're trying to run in front of it." "They're too late," Holloway said. She was in the field office for the 2nd consecutive day. Her legal team spread across 3 workstations. "We file for indictments by end of week." The case package she had assembled was the most complete Amara had seen in 11 years of federal investigations work. Financial documentation tracing the Harwood payment network through 4 shell layers to its originating investors. Communication records, obtained through proper warrant channels, showing Halvorson's coordination with political contacts. The residential camera footage from Delaney Street, time-stamped and authenticated, showing the assault with complete clarity. Calvin Reese's documented account of Mercer's request to file the false malfunction report, with a timestamp that proved it was done before the standard review window and outside normal protocol. Denon's formal statement, 5 pages, covering what he had witnessed on Delaney Street and what he had observed of Mercer's behavior in the weeks following. And 43 community testimonials, each one a thread in the same fabric. "Denton will face scrutiny," Holloway said, looking at his statement. "Defense will argue he's protecting himself by cooperating." "His statement doesn't minimize his own role," Amara said. "He acknowledges the false report. He acknowledges complicity in the initial confrontation. He's not presenting himself as innocent." He's presenting himself as honest about what happened. She paused. That's harder to attack than a clean story would be. Holloway nodded. Agreed. It'll hold. Mercer had gone quiet. That was new. The surveillance on Amara's apartment had stopped. The precinct drive-bys on Delaney Street had scaled back. Even the anonymous messages to her phone had ceased after the article dropped, as though whoever was sending them had looked at the public momentum and reassessed the value of the tactic. Quiet wasn't the same as stillness, though. Zuri's intercepts showed Mercer had made 6 calls to the private security attorney in the 48 hours after the article ran. She didn't have the content of those calls. They were on a personal line, but the pattern was clear. He was getting legal advice. He was preparing. It was Amara who reached out to meet him, not through intermediaries, not through any official channel. A direct message to his personal phone. I think we should talk. In person. One conversation, nothing recorded. He responded in 4 hours. The response was a single word. Where? They met in the parking lot of a public library on the west side of the city, late afternoon, both arriving alone as agreed. He was in civilian clothes, dark jeans, a jacket, and without the uniform, he looked smaller somehow. Not physically. He was the same size, but something that the uniform held together was visible in its absence. He was watching her as she walked toward him, and she could see him doing what she'd done on Delaney Street, cataloging, assessing, trying to read her purpose. She let him look. They stood about 4 feet apart. You've been building this for a while, he said. It wasn't quite an accusation and wasn't quite an acknowledgement. Something in between. 8 months, she said. He absorbed that. The incident on Delaney Street. I'm not here to talk about the incident, she said. You already know what the incident is worth in a courtroom. That's not what this conversation is. He looked at her warily. Then what is it? I want you to understand something. She held his gaze steady. This isn't about destroying you. It's about fixing what you broke. Those aren't the same thing, even though I imagine right now they feel identical. Something moved across his face. Not softness. He wasn't there, and she wasn't sure he could get there. But something that might have been the first recognition that the situation was more complicated than a fight he could win or lose. The network you're part of, she said. The Harwood contracts. The buried complaints. The pressure on that neighborhood. You're not the only person who made decisions that led here. But you're the person whose decisions are most clearly documented. She paused. Cooperation is still on the table. It won't erase what happened. It won't keep you out of courtroom. But it determines what kind of story gets told about who you are. He was quiet for a long time. A car moved through the parking lot, and they both tracked it instinctively and then returned to each other. Why are you telling me this? He said finally. You have the case. Because I've been doing this work for 11 years, she said, and I've learned that the difference between justice and punishment is whether the people involved understand what they actually did. Punishment can happen without understanding. Justice can't. He looked at the ground, then back at her. His jaw was tight, but something behind his eyes was working through something. She didn't press it. I need to talk to my attorney, he said. Of course. She turned to leave. Then he said, behind her, your face. From that day. A pause. I shouldn't have done that. She stopped. She didn't turn around. No, she said. You shouldn't have. She walked to her car. By Thursday morning, Holloway's team had finalized the indictment documentation. By Thursday afternoon, a federal judge had reviewed the package. By Thursday evening, the paperwork was signed. Cole called Amara at 7:15 and said 4 words, "We're ready to move." She sat with that for a moment. 8 months. The board on the wall. Gerald Whitfield's coffee. Denton's face in the diner. The intake form numbers climbing. Marcus Webb stopped 8 times on his way to school. Her father's corner. Tomorrow morning, she said. 6 a.m. I'll be there. She set the phone down and looked out the window at the city settling into evening. Somewhere out there, Mercer was sitting with his attorney reviewing options. Halvorsen was making calls that would no longer help him. Denton was home with his wife, and maybe, she hoped, the silence between them was beginning to ease. And on Delaney Street, a community that had been told in 100 small and large ways that it didn't matter was reading an article that documented, in public record, that it did. She put on her jacket and went for a walk. No cerval en sweep. No professional purpose. Just a walk in the evening air, like a person who had done something hard and was allowing herself a moment to be human about it before the next hard thing began. She walked for almost an hour. When she came back, she sat at the kitchen table and opened the case file one more time and read through it from the beginning. Not because she needed to, because it deserved to be witnessed in full before what was coming. The morning of the arrests came in gray and quiet. 6 a.m. The kind of early hour where the city hasn't fully committed to being awake yet. Delivery trucks moving through empty intersections. The first coffee shops pulling up their gates. A sky the color of old concrete, beginning its slow shift towards something lighter. Amara was already dressed when Cole called to confirm deployment. She'd been up since 4:30. Not for nerves. From the particular alertness of someone who has been working toward a fixed point for a long time and can now feel it close enough to touch. She didn't lead the arrest teams personally. That wasn't her role. And more importantly, it wasn't the right image. A federal commander directly involved in the physical detention of subjects, she had a personal connection to would have given defense attorneys a thread to pull. She stood instead at the field office with Cole and Price and Zuri and watched the operation unfold through the coordinated communication channels. Each check-in arriving in sequence like notes in a piece of music she'd spent 8 months composing. Mercer was detained at his home. 2 agents, professional and unhurried, at his front door at 6:04. His wife was present. There was no resistance, no raised voices, no dramatic moment. He came out in a gray shirt and dark pants, hands cooperating, face unreadable. One of the agents later reported that the thing that stood out most was how ordinary it looked, like watching someone accept a situation they had known was coming for longer than they wanted to admit. Halvorsen was picked up at his office, which he'd arrived at early, apparently already aware that something was moving. He had an attorney present, which meant someone had tipped him, but the tip had come too late to matter and not early enough to be useful. He said nothing during the detention process. He looked at the agents the way politicians look at unfavorable polling numbers, calculating damage rather than absorbing it. 3 other members of the Harwood Payment Network were detained simultaneously at separate locations. The precision of the coordination was something Zuri had spent 6 weeks engineering, specifically to prevent any single detention from triggering a warning to the others. Lieutenant Victor Stroud from Internal Affairs, identified in the final weeks of the investigation as the administrative conduit for buried complaints, was the last. He'd called in sick that morning, which might have been coincidence and might not have been. The agents found him at home. He came quietly. By 7:45, all 6 subjects were in federal custody. Cole looked at Amara across the office when the final confirmation came through. He didn't say anything. Neither did she. They didn't need to. Zuri, at her workstation, exhaled slowly and leaned back in her chair and looked at the ceiling. Price stood with his arms folded, looking at the deployment map, and something in his posture had settled from operational tension into something calmer. Then they went back to work because arrests are a beginning, not an ending. The press had been given a coordinated release at 7 a.m., simultaneous with the last of the detentions to prevent interference. By 8, the story was national. By 9, it was the lead segment on 4 cable news networks. The coverage had the quality of something people had been half expecting without quite believing would arrive, and there was in the public reaction a kind of collective exhale that Amara watched from a distance and found more moving than she'd anticipated. Naomi called at 8:15. "How long have you been running this?" she asked. Not accusatory, genuinely asking. 8 months before Delaney Street, Amara said. That day accelerated the timeline. A pause. The slap accelerated a federal investigation. Yes, a longer pause. He really did hit the wrong woman. He did. Naomi was quiet for a moment. "I want the full story now. All of it. When you're ready." "Soon," Amara said. "Give me 2 weeks." 2 weeks, Naomi agreed. The community response to the arrests was not a celebration. That was something Amara had thought about carefully. How a neighborhood processes the removal of a threat it has been living alongside for years. There was relief, real and visible. There was also anger that it had taken this long. There was uncertainty about what came next, whether anything would actually change or whether new names would eventually fill old roles. There was grief in some quarters for the years already spent. Gerald Whitfield called that afternoon. "People are gathering at the rec center," he said. "Not organized, just gathering." "Is it peaceful?" "It's tired," he said. "Tired is what peaceful looks like around here right now." She understood that. She drove to the rec center that evening. Not in any official capacity. She went in civilian clothes, as she had the first time she'd come back to this neighborhood, and she sat in the back of the room and listened while people talked. Some of them recognized her. Most didn't know who she was. She didn't introduce herself. What she heard was the sound of a community trying to decide whether to trust again, which was different from the sound of a community that had given up. It was harder and more honest and more valuable than any press statement. Blake Denon was having the worst week of his life, and it was also the most honest week of his life, and he was not sure yet how to hold both of those things. His name had emerged in the public reporting, not as a primary subject, but as a cooperating witness, which meant the department knew what he'd done, and so did everyone who read the news. He'd been placed on administrative leave pending an internal review, which was standard procedure and also felt, in the day-to-day texture of it, like a door being closed. He hadn't gone back to the precinct. He hadn't spoken to Mercer. He hadn't heard from most of the people he'd considered colleagues. He'd heard from his cousin Calvin, who had said, simply, "I'm glad we did it." He'd heard from Carla, who had read everything and had sat across from him at the kitchen table for a long time, and then said, "I know that was hard. I'm glad you did it." He sat with that. He'd also received, through his attorney, an acknowledgement from Holloway's team that his cooperation had been noted and would be formally reflected in the prosecutorial recommendations. That wasn't immunity. It wasn't erasure. It was what she'd promised. The truth of who he was, including the parts that weren't clean, told honestly, which turned out to be the most defensible thing he could have done. The court proceedings opened 3 weeks after the arrests. They were slow and methodical and entirely devoid of the dramatic energy that public attention had surrounded them with. Federal courts move carefully, and carefully is what they were built to do. Holloway's team was meticulous. Defense attorneys were skilled and well-funded. Halvorson's in particular, his political connections had ensured that, and the early hearings were characterized by the careful procedural chess of high-stakes federal litigation. But the evidence was what it was. The residential camera footage. The financial documentation Zuri had built through 4 shell layers. Calvin Reese's time-stamped account of the malfunction report request. Denton's formal statement. 54 community testimonials. A paper trail so thoroughly constructed that challenging any individual piece of it only revealed how many other pieces remained standing. Halvorson's attorney attempted, in the second week of hearings, to argue federal overreach, the same narrative Halvorson had tried to plant through political channels before the arrests. Holloway dismantled it with the authorization documentation Cole had prepared for exactly that argument, presenting a procedural chain so clean it took the argument apart at its foundation. Halvorson himself, watching from the defense table, had the expression of a man watching a building he owns burn down. Not helpless. He was too controlled for helpless, but comprehending, steadily and without escape, that the narrative he'd spent years constructing had met something more durable than itself. Mercer, through his attorney, had entered into a cooperation agreement in the week before court opened. It wasn't the full accounting Amara had hoped for in the parking lot conversation. It was legal strategy, not moral reckoning, and she understood the difference. But it provided additional documentation of the Harwood payment network that filled 2 gaps in Holloway's financial chain, and it carried with it the implicit acknowledgement of culpability that formal cooperation always contains. Amara attended several of the early hearings, seated in the gallery, in civilian clothes. On the 3rd day, she wore her uniform, not as performance. She had legitimate professional reasons to be present in formal capacity that day, but she was aware of what it communicated, and she was not ashamed of that awareness. When Mercer was escorted into the courtroom that morning and looked out at the gallery, his eyes found her for a moment. She held his gaze. His was the face of a man living inside the consequences of his choices, which was not the same as a man who understood those choices, and she knew better than to expect more than that. But she held his gaze until he looked away. The hearing ended with procedural matters settled and a trial date confirmed. On the steps outside, Naomi fell in a step beside her. "How does it feel?" Naomi asked. Amara thought about it honestly for a moment. "Incomplete," she said. "Like the first chapter of something, not the last." Naomi nodded. "That's the honest answer. It's the only one I have." She looked at the courthouse steps and thought about her father, about what he would have made of this day, this building, this particular version of fight. He had lived a smaller version without the tools or authority she'd built over years of deliberate work. She thought he would have been proud. She thought he would also have said, in his particular way, "Now what are you going to do with it?" That question was already being answered. The department had announced, the previous week, the formation of an external oversight committee for civilian members, one retired federal judge, 2 community representatives, including Gerald Whitfield, who had accepted the invitation after making clear he would say exactly what he thought, and they were welcome to it. New leadership discussions were underway for the precinct. The internal affairs restructuring had begun with the removal of the processes that had allowed complaint reclassification to happen outside of documented review chains. None of it was finished. All of it was started. Amara had been asked to consult on the Oversight Committee framework. She'd said yes. The trial lasted 11 weeks. Not because the evidence was insufficient. It was extensive, but because the defense teams were thorough and the judge was careful and the system moved at the speed the system moved. Amara had known this going in. Justice as a process is not the same as justice as a feeling, and the gap between the two requires patience that doesn't come naturally to anyone watching from outside. She attended when she could and followed the rest through Holloway's daily briefings. She continued working. Operation Iron Shield was formally closed at the 6-week mark. The evidence phase complete, the case handed to prosecution. But the reform consultancy work that had grown out of it was now its own ongoing project, which suited her in ways she was still understanding. The verdicts came on a Tuesday morning in late autumn. Mercer, guilty on 4 counts, including assault under color of law, civil rights violation, and 2 counts related to the Harwood Payment Network. His cooperation agreement had reduced the potential sentencing range, which was the arrangement's purpose, and which Holloway had negotiated with the precision she brought to everything. Halvorsen, guilty on 6 counts. The fuller picture, the systemic rot with a name attached to it. He received a sentence that would keep him from the promotion he'd spent years maneuvering toward, and from the political world he'd used as both stage and shield for longer than that world would wait for him. The 3 Harwood Network officers and Lieutenant Stroud received sentences calibrated to their roles, not identical, because their involvement wasn't identical. The judge, in her sentencing remarks, used the phrase systemic breach of public trust twice. Naomi wrote that phrase down and would use it as the title of a chapter in something longer she was already constructing. The verdicts landed in the community the way rain lands on dry ground, absorbed immediately, completely, by something that had been waiting a long time. Gerald Whitfield sat in his barbershop that afternoon and did not say much, which was how Amara knew it had mattered. Some things run too deep for words right away. They need time to settle into the shape of what they actually mean. Blake Denton wasn't in the courtroom for the verdicts. He'd requested not to be, and Holloway had seen no legal reason to require it. He was at home with Carla, who had taken a day off work. They'd watched the coverage on the news and then turned it off and sat together in a silence that had finally, after months of wait and distance, become a comfortable one. 3 weeks after the verdicts, Denton was offered a transfer to the department's newly formed Community Relations Unit, a position that had been created as part of the Oversight Committee's early reform recommendations. It was a real job, not a consolation. It required the things he was actually good at: reading people, listening, the kind of patient attentiveness that made him a capable officer when he was pointed in the right direction. His first week, he spent 3 mornings at the Delaney Street Rec Center meeting residents. On his 3rd morning, Gerald Whitfield stopped in. They sat across from each other at a folding table and talked for 40 minutes. Neither of them reported what was said in that conversation, and both of them came away from it changed in small ways that would take time to fully understand. Naomi had been working on something larger since before the verdicts. What had started as a documentary project, she'd partnered with an independent production company that had come to her after her investigative series ran nationally, had grown into something more expansive. Not just the story of this precinct and these arrests, but the architecture of the thing. How it was built, how it was maintained, how it ended. She'd spent 2 months interviewing people across the full range of the story. Community members, Denton, Calvin Reese, 2 of the oversight committee members, Holloway, Cole, Zuri, Price. She hadn't asked Mercer for an interview. She'd sent the request through his attorney, and he'd declined, which was his right, and which she'd noted in her notes as information of its own kind. She asked Amara last. They met at Gerald's barber shop, which had seemed right to both of them without either one needing to say why. Gerald made coffee and then found reasons to be in the back room, because he understood the shape of the conversation without being told. Naomi set up her recorder. "Tell me how it started," she said. "The real start. Before Delaney Street." Amara thought about her father. About a 9-year-old girl on a corner watching something she didn't have words for yet, but would spend the next 3 decades finding the tools to address. About the way a single afternoon can contain the seeds of everything that follows it, if you tend them right. "It started," she said, "with a man who deserved better and didn't get it. And I decided, somewhere along the way, that I could either be angry about that or I could make it mean something." She paused. "I chose meaning." Naomi nodded and let the recorder run. The documentary was completed 7 months later and screened at 3 film festivals before finding a national broadcast partner. It did not resolve the questions it raised into neat answers. Naomi was too good a journalist for that. What it did was hold the full complexity of what had happened in Delaney Street and the streets around it and the systems behind those streets, and let viewers sit inside that complexity long enough to understand what was actually at stake. Amara was offered the position of deputy director of a newly formed National Law Enforcement Reform Task Force in the same month the documentary aired. The task force had been assembled from a combination of federal initiative and advocacy pressure, the kind of structural response that only emerges when enough individual cases accumulate into an undeniable pattern. She took 3 days to think about it. It was a bigger platform, more visibility, more influence over the shape of the systems she'd been working inside and against for 11 years. It was also further from a street-level work she understood most deeply, and that distance had a cost she was honest enough to name. She called Cole. "You gonna take it?" he said. "I haven't decided yet." "Yes, you have. You're calling me to confirm what you already know." She was quiet for a moment. "It feels like leaving something unfinished." "The work is never finished," he said. "That's not the same as it not being worth doing." A pause. "You built something here, Amara. Now go build it somewhere larger." She accepted the position on a Wednesday morning, in writing, the way she did everything official, clearly and without ceremony. The last thing she did before her final day at the field office was visit the board on the wall. 8 months of work, most of it already archived and filed and submitted and reviewed and ruled upon. Just the board itself left, with its photographs and timelines and color-coded connections. She stood in front of it for a long time. Then she visited her father. The cemetery was on the east side of the city, modest and well-kept, the kind of place that doesn't announce itself. She'd been here a handful of times since the investigation began. Quick visits, hurried, always with somewhere else to be. This time she had nowhere else to be, so she stayed. She stood at his grave for a long time without speaking. There's a lot she could have said, could have told him about the case, about the board, about the verdicts, about the task force position. She didn't say any of it. She stood there and let him be her father and let herself be his daughter, without the work between them for once. After a while she said, quietly, "I think you'd be okay with how it went." The wind moved through the trees at the edge of the cemetery. She took that for the answer it was. The police community dialogue event at the Delaney Street Rec Center happened on a Saturday in early December, 3 months after the verdicts. It was organized by the Oversight Committee and the Community Board jointly. Not a press event, not a photo opportunity. Real tables in a real room with real people on both sides of a real conversation. It was not comfortable. Comfort was not the point. People said things that were hard to hear. Officers who hadn't been part of the Mercer network said things that were honest about the culture they'd been part of without fully seeing. Community members said things they'd been holding for years and had never had a forum for that felt genuine. There were moments that went sideways and had to be redirected, and moments of unexpected clarity that the room sat inside, quietly, like a shared understanding arriving. Gerald Whitfield spoke near the end. He talked about his nephew's $200. He talked about 30 years of watching things happen and documenting things and filing things and being told there was nothing to be done. He talked about what it meant, practically in the texture of daily life, to live in a neighborhood where the people whose job it was to protect you were also the people you had learned to be afraid of. He didn't end with forgiveness, because that wasn't his to give or withhold on behalf of everyone who had experienced what he'd experienced. He ended with a question. What do you go to do now? The room didn't have a single answer. It had 100 of them, all incomplete, all part of the same ongoing work. Amara sat near the back and listened. She wasn't running this room. She was learning from it, the way she'd learned from Gerald's coffee 3 seasons ago, and from Denton's face in the diner, and from the intake form numbers climbing, and from 54 people who had trusted her with their worst experiences because they decided it might finally matter. Afterward, in the parking lot, a woman touched her arm. Older, 60s, with careful eyes and a coat buttoned against the December cold. "I heard what you did," the woman said. "I didn't believe it at first. People like us don't usually get that. People like us deserve it," Amara said. The woman looked at her for a moment. Then she nodded once, like something had been confirmed, and walked to her car. Amara stood in the parking lot for a moment in the cold air. Somewhere in the building behind her the conversation was still going. She could hear the murmur of it through the closed doors. Ongoing. Unresolved. Necessary. She drove to the new office the following Monday morning in full uniform. The task force headquarters was in a federal building downtown. Clean hallways, institutional lighting, conference rooms with whiteboards still blank, waiting to be filled. She was scheduled to address the first cohort of new recruits that afternoon. 32 people from departments across 6 states who had been selected for a national reform training program. She'd spent a week thinking about what to say to them. She stood at the front of the room and looked at 32 faces looking back at her. Young, a little uncertain, aware they were at the beginning of something. She thought about everything that had led to this room. The corner on Delaney Street. Her father's arm around her shoulders in a photograph she still carried. The slap and the silence that followed it. The board on the wall. The coffee in Gerald's barbershop. Denton's hands flat on the table. The intake form numbers. The verdicts. The woman in the parking lot who said people like us don't usually get that. She thought about what she wanted these 32 people to understand before they spent a single day in the field. She said, authority isn't power. It's responsibility. The difference between those two things is everything. It's every interaction you will have, every decision you will make, every moment when you have the force of law behind you and someone in front of you who doesn't. Power asks what it can do. Responsibility asks what it should do. She paused. That question, what should I do, is the one I need you to carry with you every single day. Not because it's easy, because nothing important ever is. She looked at them for a moment. Let's get to work. If the people meant to protect that community had simply done their jobs, does justice ever actually arrive on its own? Or does it only move when someone powerful enough forces it to? If this story hit home, like subscribe and stay close. The next one is coming, and it hits just as hard.